We are here with Professor Madeleine Beekman, who is an evolutionary biologist, a bee watcher, a cassowary enthusiast, and author of The Origin of Language, How We Learn to Speak and Why. Madeleine, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you're an evolutionary biologist. What was it that fueled your interest in language?
I didn't have any interest in language. That's a funny part of the story.
Okay. All right.
Despite the fact that it's so interesting?
Yes, now I know it's interesting, but I didn't because I never thought about language, apart from trying to learn new languages, etc. No, so the story is, as you said, I'm an evolutionary biologist, bee watcher, ant watcher, slime mold watcher. I
Yes.
watched all sorts of things, but never humans. However, at some stage, I decided I need a new challenge, and I wanted that challenge to be to write a book for a general audience. And that book had to be about evolution because I'm an evolutionary biologist. And the other main reason for wanting to write that book on evolution is because I felt I didn't quite understand how evolution works. Because I always looked at organisms from the level, the Darwinian level. So these ones survive and these ones don't survive. But I never tried to link that back to what happens at the genetic level. And of course, everyone started talking about genetics and genomics and all these complicated things they do in the lab, which I tried lab work once and that was enough.
Okay.
Because you can't see stuff, you can't see DNA and you move something from one tube to another and then apparently you lost it somewhere. Anyway, so that was my career in the lab. So I thought, I'm going to write about it. Anyway, so that was my desire to write a book on how evolution works. But then I thought, that's a big question.
It's very big.
It's very big, and that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So then I thought, I need to have some sort of framework, and I want that framework to be interesting to people. Well, what do people care about? They care about humans. So I sort of begrudgingly thought, okay, I'll get into human evolution. It's never been an interest of mine at all. But then, of course, I started reading, and I realized this is actually really, really cool. Still, language had nothing to do with it. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
But then I started putting all these different pieces of the puzzle together. So all this weird stuff that happened, humans or our ancestors came out down from the trees, started walking on two legs, that required changes to the skeleton. It made them extremely vulnerable in an environment full of large predators, so they had to become social. Giving birth to children became a little bit more difficult because of the change in the rotation of the birth canal. So now the mother couldn't help the baby out, so she needed help from someone else. So our early ancestors started to be social. And if you are a social organism, you have to have some form of communication. Bees do it, ants do it, bacteria do it, social birds do it, other primates do it. Still didn't really think about language until much later in our evolutionary history. We had this weird mutation that made our brain just explode, balloon, which meant that our skull needed to change. Either it was basically die or the skull had to adapt to having that large brain in it. That works because otherwise we wouldn't be here. That gave us the morphology to be able to speak more precisely or to make sounds that we can control better, I should say, by controlling our breathing, controlling the muscular of our face, our tongue. But at the same time, we had these babies with massive brains, because if you have an adult with a huge brain, of course, an adult starts as a little baby. These babies could now no longer stay in a mother for longer because first off, brain tissue is extremely expensive, so the mother could not afford energetically to extend the duration of pregnancy. But the other tiny slight issue is that if you have if you're a baby with a really big head and your mum has relatively narrow hips, two things don't really work together.
Yeah, I'm always so envious when I see other species. Have you ever seen like a panda give birth or a
Nope.
giraffe? It's
It just
so
goes,
effortless. It is
not
They
so.
for
just
you,
pop those
mate.
things out.
Not for
And
you.
then the ones that outsource it even more to like making eggs or like marsupials, that's so.
Yeah,
It
well,
seems
they
very small.
are tiny, tiny, tiny.
And you talk about brain
Exactly.
size. My young one's brains, I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and their brains, you mentioned in the book that their brains start out about a quarter of the size that it's going to be in adulthood, and then it grows by age, you said, I think 7, it gets to about 95%. So right now, their brains are growing so fast and it's driving them crazy because they're getting all this brain tissue and neural connections, and they're basically just little maniacs with no emotional regulation, no long term memory before the age of 4. It drives them mad. So we're seeing a lot of brain changes going from babyhood to adulthood, and you got to get those big heads out quickly. But what does that mean?
But it's even worse though, because by the time they become teenagers, they have complete rewiring of the brain. So that's when they really go insane. So you've got something to look forward to.
Oh, lovely.
So, how does the growth of the brain size work with the fact that often people talk about that pruning of synapses is the thing that happens as a child grows up, that you have all these connections in the brain that you prune away so that you have fewer connections. But how does that work if your brain size is also increasing?
No, your brain size, well, I guess your brain size is increasing because your tissue is increasing. I don't really know. I mean, I'm not a neurologist, but also people keep changing, scientists keep changing their minds about the way the brain is connected, because it's a paper I cited in the book, which came out quite late. And I think I only edited in later when I read it. So this claims that it's not so much the actual connections between neurons via the axons, those the long little thingies that you see often stereotyped in cartoons, etc. But it's more that the different parts of the brain are connected via waves of signals. So, as I said, people, because they start to have more advanced technology to really look at the ways brains work, I guess. So, you know, it,
I
things just
think I see
change.
what you mean. So it's like, have you heard of that kind of urban planning where when you build an area for walkways, the first year you only put in lawns, and then you watch where people walk, and then you make paths there. So is that the kind of metaphor that sort of works? So like the brain, every in the beginning, everything is low level connected, but then the things that you do more often are strengthened.
I guess so, because that's how learning works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if you never use parts of your brain, I mean, it's like muscles. If you don't use your muscles or particular muscles, there's no point in putting energy in them to maintain them. So you basically lose them.
But I've also heard it, and I'm not an expert. This is just, I basically over the last 10 years of doing the show, I've absorbed some really good things and some terrible rubbish. But one thing that I absorbed was that your brain is a certain way, and then at certain ages, you develop, boom, all tons of new neural connections, and then they get pruned and pruned and pruned and pruned. And then in adolescence, boom, more neural connections again, prune, prune, prune,
I
prune, prune.
see.
And this is how, I hope I'm right here, but that's how I've heard learning described.
Just to follow up on that, because I have a granddaughter who is now 7 months or something, and her parents, because it's their first child, so they do a lot of reading about developmental jumps, etc. And every time she goes through this phase where it's a little girl, she goes through this phase where she she's just hard to handle. She doesn't want to sleep, etc. And then soon after, there's something that she can do now that she couldn't do before. So
Mm.
apparently they link that again to jumps in the development. Maybe it all gets a little bit scrambled and then, oh, now I understand why I'm so bad, because now I can do whatever it is. But again, I'm not a neurologist or whatever, so I'm.
Okay, we won't lean too hard on that.
Bring it back to the book and the overall story that you were telling about the development of the brain size and the shorter gestation period. So you're pregnant for a shorter amount of time, maybe because you need to get your baby out earlier and childbirth becomes more difficult and you need more help with it, etc. So where was that going? What was your next step in your narrative that you were building there?
So pregnancy actually isn't shorter. It's funny because I too thought that human pregnancy was exceptionally short or something, but it's not. It falls within the same range as all the other great apes. It's just that when we poop them out, they're just totally useless babies. And they stay useless for about 15 years. So people have done calculations. And that's probably an underestimate because this is based on the energy that they bring in relative to the energy that they require to sustain themselves. And that's based on hunter-gatherers. So if you're talking about modern teenagers, you can probably add about 10 years or something.
To be fair, it's harder to be a human than it is to be a giraffe,
I don't know. That long neck must be quite troublesome.
Okay. The vagus nerve alone. Okay. Well, then let's build up the picture because I had a huge list and you just ran through a bunch of them. So let's go through the ones that you ran through. There's brain size. We have big brains, big smart brains, and that helps language. But hip size hasn't increased. You'd have to have just this massive pelvis, and that's no good for running around like the exhaustion hunters that we are. You mentioned also, so early birth, but that makes mum and bub very vulnerable. So it takes a community. And what are you going to do with the community? Talk to them. I've got a ton of other things as well. I've got, you mentioned sweating in the book. That was a part of the picture.
Sweating. I don't enjoy sweating. What
Oh,
is a
don't
good
move
word?
to the tropics then.
I have lived in the tropics. It was rough, yeah.
But if you're chasing stuff down, it helps.
It does.
But do humans sweat more than chimpanzees?
Yes.
We have
Huh.
sweat glands
Yeah.
all over the place.
So we have, well, particularly on the head. And we need that to keep that bloody brain cool because that brain requires a quarter of all the energy. So when you're sitting still, you don't do anything, you still need about 25% of all the energy that your body requires just to stay alive goes to your brain. So, and your brain is extremely vulnerable to overeating. So it's the sweating that keeps our head cool. And that's the sweating that allowed us, together with the changed skeleton that comes with walking on two legs, that allowed Homo erectus probably to outrun, or not so much outrun, to run for longer than its prey. So the prey can't sweat, so they basically have to stop running. And then the hunter comes and says, hello, bloop.
Mm,
We're scary beings. There was something
yeah.
else you mentioned in the book, and that's eyes. We can see the whites of each other's eyes, which means we can track eye gaze, which means that we can read each other's expressions. So eyes are a part of the picture too.
Well, eyes are extremely important because for non-verbal communication, for one thing. So, for example, because it's still hard to imagine how language actually started, isn't it? So we can imagine that individuals made noises, chimpanzees make noises, they have particular grunts for particular reasons, etc. But they don't have the control over their breathing, they don't have the control over the tongue and facial muscles, etc., to really mold the sound that comes out of my throat, that goes over my vocal cords. But then you still have to ask yourself, well, where did the first words came from? And I can imagine that if I make a particular sound because I want you to look at something, if I make that sound and I look at it, then because of the way our eyes are structured, you can easily see where I'm looking. So it helps basically, in a way, communicating what I'm trying to tell you.
Reading intentions.
Reading
Yeah.
intention.
The Pixar movie Brave. I
Yeah.
suppose I can spoil something about it because it's a multi-decades old film. The plot of the movie Brave is a young girl who accidentally, using magic, turns her mother into a bear.
As you do.
As you do. And at first, this mother bear is a kind of a funny bear and they're trying to turn her back into a human. But later in the movie, there comes a point where it looks like mom is going to turn irreversibly into a bear. They're not going to be able to use magic to get her back. And the animators did something very interesting to communicate that. When Mother was a nice bear, kind of a human bear, you could see the whites of her eyes, you could see her sclera. But when she starts to turn irrevocably into a bear, that's gone.
Really?
Her eyes are just eyes. And I thought that's such a good way
That's
of
smart.
communicating that. So I just thought that was interesting.
That is funny.
That is funny. That's also why I was at the Halloween store yesterday, as you may or may not notice. And I was looking at various contact lenses. So you can make contact lenses, you make your eyes red or green or something, but you can also just have large ones. And they can be like pretty large. There are special ones you can get that cover your entire eye. And it gives like black or for something like or red. And it is so
Creepy.
That is so
small
wrong.
change. It's such a small thing. Like if you're going to go to a Halloween party, you can spend lots of time on lots of costumes, but if you want to really freak people out, then just do something with your pupils. It really is very unsettling. Very quickly. It's very fun. I have bought some.
Wow, that's a
they're
really good
green.
idea to put those things into your eyes.
Yeah. They're green with like a cat. I can't use them yet. They need to soak for a bit longer. But social species such as bees and I believe slime mold.
No, slime
Right.
molds are not social. That was an
No,
aberration.
they're not social. They're not social, but they
No,
communicate.
I guess they're not, are they?
No, slime molds is confusing. There are two major types of slime molds. There's the ones that live alone, communicate, and then come together. Or there's the one that I worked on, which is basically a big blob of slime. I mean, seriously, it can be really big if you just keep feeding it and giving it space. That's the one I worked on. And the idea was to see if you don't have a brain, if you can learn things and remember. Well, the answer is no, you can't. But we
Yeah.
tried.
I know about this because friend of the show and my husband, Stephen Mann, came to visit you in Sydney and saw some of your slime mold when he was a PhD student at ANU, and he's interested in communication and signals, etc.
Oh.
Yeah, he says hi, by the way, but you might not.
How nice.
But I wanted to know how your work on other social beings, slime mold excluded, bees included, because bees don't have whites of their eyes and they don't have tiny pelvises and whatever else. So is there anything you learned from your previous work on non-humans that informed the writing of this book?
Well, the main thing is that, and that's probably why language sort of popped out when I was thinking about human evolution, is that in order to be social, you have to be able to communicate, because even very primitive forms of communication. So there's the other slime molds that I just talked about, like many bacteria, they're not bacteria, but similar. They use very, very simple communication if they want to come together to form an aggregate, and they use chemical cues. Other primates, chimpanzees, live in social groups. They use communication. The gorillas use communication. Orangutans don't because they're solitary. But all the social insects, they all have a form of communication. So in ants and termites, that tends to be chemical because they don't fly. So they just lay pheromone deposits on the ground, often, depending on the species, and that's the means of communication. Others have more direct communication. They talk with their antennae. In fact, they all also talk with their antennae because, are you one of are you my family or are you someone else? So chemical cues are extremely important in social insects. And the bees, of course, they dance. They have a famous dance language. Now, that dance language has been studied since it was first described in the 1950s by Carl von Frisch. But what people don't necessarily realize is that there's about 11 or 12 species of honeybee, depending on whom you ask, because some people like to split species and others like to keep them together. But anyway,
As linguists, we are completely unfamiliar with this
but
problem.
splitting
We don't know anything about language and
Lovers and
dialects.
splitters? This
That's
is very strange to me.
news to us. Yes.
So the The 11 or 12 species can be put into three basic groups. One is the one that everyone's familiar with, that we often keep in hives. But in the wild, they live in a hollow in a tree. And somehow, when they move house, which they do when the first hollow becomes too large, they reproduce by making what we call a swarm. And that swarm is basically a daughter colony that has to find its new home. Now, how do you communicate where there is an entrance, which can be this small, in a tree? You have to have some form of communication. So the dance language of those species that nest in hollows or in hollow trees is much more precise than the same dance language, because all the species of honeybees have the same basic dance language, than, say, the dwarf honeybees. So the dwarf honeybees, they all live in Southeast Asia. They make colonies. This is a single comb, is about this size, and it hangs off a twig in a shaded tree or bush or whatever. They basically need a little twig and they need some shade. Now, when they communicate, when they're going to move, they, as I said, they use the same dance language, but it's sort of like, we go some sort of that
This,
direction
vaguely
and
this.
sort it out. Yeah, we sort it out when we're there. Whereas the ones that live in the hollows, it's no. That's where we're going and nowhere else. So that's sort of, so I've worked on that for, I don't know, way too long probably, with a large number of students and other people in the field, which is always lovely. So that must have been in the back of my mind. And I actually wrote a paper synthesizing that all, linking that back to the evolution or the necessity of precise communication in the bees. And then the argument was, or still is, that if you have a difficult problem that you need to solve, for which you need communication, then that communication needs to be much more precise than when the problem you're trying to solve is much easier. Now, what is a very difficult problem in our human evolution is producing those totally useless, dependent babies, which you can't raise by yourself.
I mean, you can try, but
It's hard.
Well, people do try, but now it's different because not many women do it really by themselves, because that's probably still impossible. But throughout our evolutionary history, so going back to about 4 million years, when our ancestors first came down from the trees, find themselves in this really dangerous environment, now walking on two legs, can't run anymore. If I have a baby, I have to hold it in my arms. So what else am I going to do with my arms? Don't even have tools. Anyway, so they started to be social. Maybe they were social up in the trees. But when they came down from the trees, then it was really necessary to be social, just safety in numbers. Then you start to have communication, as I said. Then when we had this brain fluke, you can call it a brain fluke, then it really became important to have very strong social bonds to help you raise those useless babies. But at the same time, those useless babies are actually really important in the whole story, because when you're born with a very undeveloped brain, you have a lot of neuroplasticity because the brain is not finished. So these babies, their brains are just sponges for information. But the other thing is, because they are so totally useless, they are totally dependent on other individuals. So as soon as they're born, they have all these tricks to make sure that there are enough people that fall in the trap of falling in love with them and looking after them until they are mature enough to do it themselves. So you get this two-way communication, basically. So the babies learn to manipulate the other individuals around them. The other individuals around them learn to manipulate the other people around them to help them with babies. And that's just a very strong selective force to shape a primitive communication system in something that's much more sophisticated, which now at the same time wasn't just necessary, but it was also possible because of the changes to the skull. That was a very long answer.
What do you think about this idea that one of the great things about being human is that we have these brains and they're very plastic. And in a way, if you need a community of people to do something, if you hard code it into the genes, that's a very expensive thing to do evolutionarily, right? It's like selective pressure takes a very, very long time. You can do it very incrementally. But cultural evolution, like having a norm or a practice or a way of doing things, it's much cheaper evolutionarily cost for the community. So one of the benefits of having the brains being so big and so plastic is that you can actually bypass, in a way, some of the genetics, which is very expensive and takes forever, and it's not very flexible. So if you find yourself in a new evolutionary landscape and you need to start eating different food, behaving differently, it's going to take you hundreds, if not thousands of years. To change your genetic makeup, but it's going to take you like a couple of generations to maybe change your cultural behavior. So what do you think about the load? So you talked about that the need to have language comes from this need to solve this difficult specific problem about child rearing. How much of, now that comes the $1 million question, right? How much of that do you think is about a genetic change?
So are you getting to the Chomsky's language acquisition
I
device?
think we can kind of, can we, we're actually,
Are we not talking about Chomsky?
no, I just think that he's one character in this debate, and I guess I just tired of talking about his perspective at all
Good.
times.
Good. Let's just totally ignore it. I think too many people, especially when I started talking about the Human Genome Project, once we have the genome of humans, we will know what it means to be human, etc. And that was a
Mm.
massive disappointment because, as a matter of fact, a gene for is extremely rare. So, people did look for the language gene. They thought they found the language gene. Did it turn out that it was not the language gene? It's a gene that's important for vocalization, but birds have it, mice have it, and they don't have language. I think it's misguided often that people are looking for a gene for something particular.
I did read how you mentioned about how the story about FOXP2, supposedly the language gene, unraveled. And are we still looking? Are there any new candidates? It doesn't sound like that's really a productive angle.
No, as far
And
as I know, I couldn't find anything. So when I was looking for the language gene, it was FOXP2 that came up. Then it was debunked. And I think people have realized, well, this is just too complicated to have a gene. So you have a species that already has primitive communication because it is social. And there's this weird fluke that allows it, oh, I can actually really control the sound that I make. And then that's combined with the need to communicate more clearly, because if you communicate more clearly, you're better able to ask for the help that you need, which means you can increase your reproductive output, which is what Darwinian selection acts on. And then Bob's your uncle. So it's morphology more that was changes in morphology that were driven by this weird mutation that made the brain balloon. But like so many major things that happen in evolutionary history of any species that you look at in detail, they're just flukes. Some weird thing happens, and either the individuals that have it go extinct, or they don't, and that's because they find a solution. And that's what I find so fascinating about our own evolutionary history. If you go back to the ancestor that we shared with chimpanzees and bonobos, it's just one mistake after another, after another, after another, and natural selection thinking, oh, what do I do with this now? Shall I let them go extinct, or shall we find a solution? Oh, what? We'll find a solution. And then the ultimate solution for the biggest problem is, oh, let them speak and let them talk all the other ones out of existence. And here we are,
But
still talking about it.
still talking.
but I mean, it is, with the risk of sounding like a high schooler who's on weed. Like humans are really, like, we're very I know we're not. I know there are similarities. I know humans are animals. I know humans are animals, but we're quite different. And
We're
I know
weird.
that there are things that happen in other species that look somewhat similar. People like to play this game of like taking Hawkes design features of language and then seeing how many of them gray parrots or bonobos, fulfill, etc. But the truth of the matter is no one else is building like skyscrapers and United Nations and
Termites do. Come on. Termites are
okay,
tiny
right.
and they build huge
No one else
skyscrapers.
has Timu and AliExpress. I'm not saying that's the best of our production.
I don't
I'm not
think.
saying that's the height of human.
The way you said it once, Hedvig, and I really liked it. I
Oh.
remembered it was, yeah, we're weird. Other animals do communication stuff, but they're not writing newspapers.
Newspaper is a good one. National parliaments, like we do things at a level, at a scale, if not difference in quality, which is probably also true, but certainly difference in quantity. And it is bizarre to think that you just called it, Madeleine. You just said a fluke, another fluke, but like it's.
Can I read something? Hedvig, you mentioned
Mhm.
Charles Hockett, and there's a quote that I really liked that he said, and I wasn't aware of this until much, much later as a linguist. Can I? It's a little long, but I'd like to read it. The crucial property notion is like the old idea that our ancestors rather suddenly crossed a Rubicon by learning to speak. Now, to be sure, there may actually have been some single most vital step, genetic or cultural or both, in the emergence of language from what preceded, and if there was, the feature involved may be one we have not yet identified. But I believe, says Hockett, a much more fruitful working assumption is what some investigators have called the mosaic, or perhaps now the hodgepodge theory. This theory proposes that the universal human institution we call language, no matter how well integrated or monolithic it now seems to be, came into being as the result of the serendipitous coming together of various innovations that had occurred at diverse times and places, some of which may not at the outset have had any particular connection with one another. And I just like that quote,
That's
and I
a
wonder
nice
what you
quote.
think about it.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Short answer. But you're right that once we had language, nothing was ever the same again because it is the most powerful tool that allowed us to build skyscrapers, to write newspapers, to come up with political systems. We have parliaments and etc. etc. So cultural evolution, which was important, and cultural evolution also happens in other social animals. But once language was there, it just went through the roof, and it just sped up our evolutionary change. I mean, even though our bodies haven't changed, although our brains got a little smaller since, which is interesting. Um, but otherwise, we haven't changed. But of course, everything else has changed because we're not masters of the universe, but we do have much better control or much more control over our own destiny than any other species has because we organize things, we build
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, when I think about it too much, I do really feel like, those people on like Ancient Aliens on the History Channel or someone really high because it is amazing what we can do. And I also find it exciting as a researcher that there's so much that we still don't know. I work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and I'm surrounded by people who are trying to answer these kind of questions all the time. And everyone has a different angle and there are also sort of trends and waves, like you said. For a while, people were fascinated by this idea, then this idea, and so it's such a fruitful area for research as well. And it is ourselves. Um, it's yeah. Sometimes it really blows my mind.
There's one little gap that I'm still having here. We've been describing a lot of preconditions for language, like being social, immature young, brains, that one brain fluke that caused a mutation that allowed our brains to just become massive. But let's just talk about here we all are. We're a bunch of beings with the brains that we have. We're in a social relationship, but we're not quite doing what we might describe yet as language. What was the step? How did we get there? You mentioned being able to make sounds very precisely. Is that what we're thinking was the Rubicon, and then we go to words and then to syntax? What's the on-ramp that you see from your research?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm not a linguist.
Like we'd be any use.
But if you think about the way children learn the language, they hear the sound, or someone is pointing at something and they say the particular word, and here are the eyes again. That makes it easier. So the baby or the toddler or whatever. No, it starts as babies, really. So they start making these associations. Apparently, babies are extremely good at making statistical associations because that's how they learn syntax. Okay, well, this word more frequently follows this word than etc.
Prediction.
Prediction.
Yeah. We also have our own theory from this podcast. We call it the Ben Ainsley theory, I think, of children's learning, which is I think a joint labor between me and Ben, to be fair, Danielle, which is babies also, going back to what you said about needs, like they can't control their environment very much and they want to control it. They want to eat or poop or something at certain times, and they have nothing better to do. They don't have jobs. They don't have anything else to do but to try to get the thing that they want and to learn the communication system around them that enables them to do that. So,
and they've got like 14 hours a day just to listen to the patterns all around them. So
yeah,
there's nothing else going on.
There's not a lot else going on, yeah.
Not much.
I mean, the question still is, well, what was the first word and how was the first word constructed? I don't know. I don't think anyone will ever know. What I do know is that somehow we took control over the sounds that we make because we could. And maybe, well, you probably know this better than I do, that song was basically the basis of language. Had song first and language came second.
I've heard that.
And song
I've heard
being really important again as a social glue, getting people together, but also to make work lighter, etc.
Well, there is like a function of language that Jakobson talks about as well, which is like phatic, which is just like, is the channel open? Are we doing a thing together? Not really transmitting information as such, but more just testing the social bond, which is a function of language that I think people ignore sometimes when you think of it as pure sort of informational transfer. But I think I've heard the theory that gesture comes before speech more often than song before language.
Yeah, but then
That there's
gesture became first again. I mean, gestures must have been there from the beginning, because if you can't speak, that's the only thing you can do, isn't it? You can look at things and you can point or try and say,
well,
well,
you could,
this
I
hurts,
guess you
or,
could theorize, that you could grunt badly.
yes.
But I agree with you, yeah.
I just give the mushiest answer of all, and that is I just think it was all happening at once and we were just trying everything because we had lots of needs and we had lots of abilities and we were doing gesture and we were doing precise sounds and we were doing imitations of nature and we were, oops, I can't talk any more about this because we banned a discussion of the origin of language on the show in
Oh,
17...
did we?
Oh, sorry. But anyway, no, I'm going to break the ban. Yeah, we were just trying everything and seeing what worked. I think that's just a really human thing. And I don't see how we can say, oh, no, well, it was all gesture until at some point we made a jump to say, no, come on. We were just doing all this. We were doing all the things.
I mean, chimpanzees, they use gestures. They use
Yeah.
grunts and they use, and so I often try to keep my hands still when I'm speaking, but I can't, and I'm
Oh,
not
yeah?
even Italian. So we still use gestures all the time as well.
Yeah.
It's part of language. Well, body language. You call it body language for a reason, isn't it?
But it's interesting that all three of us are sort of like, we're having all those shared views here that I think it's important to point out to the listeners are not necessarily universal in the research world. One of them being that like gesture was probably co-evolving or before speech, and the other one is that language evolves for connecting communicatively to other people and not for cognitively structuring your inner world, which is actually another perspective that I personally tend to forget sometimes. So I feel like It's
Are you smuggling
it's
Chomsky in here?
I don't think it's only Chomsky. I think there's nuance in that view as well. I don't think it's, I mean, maybe we're making a straw man out of it, but we're talking here about a perspective that is that like humans have problems and they need to solve them and they throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and some of it sticks. And that's sort of how evolution kind of works. You, as a species, you're in a new environment or a new problem, or you need to expand somehow, or you find a niche that you can exploit to have more reproductive success. And that's why you do it. And that it's, yeah. Sorry, that wasn't a question. That was just a note to our
So I just
listeners.
started reading a book, and unfortunately, I don't have it here. But the title is, the title is More Than Words.
Hmm? More than was?
But anyway, and if I've only started the first chapter last night. But her main argument, she's a psychologist, I think. So her argument is that language is more than just communication. It's also important for our inner life or inner workings.
Hmm.
Why do we talk to ourselves? Why do we talk in our head? And I know that it's controversial again because there's also a theory, isn't it? I can't remember because I was told very early on when I was writing this book, just forget that, that's outdated. People don't believe that anymore. That people who speak different languages think differently.
Well,
Yeah.
we can tee up a coming interview about it's the thing we've talked about this show many times, like the general linguistic relativity hypothesis, sometimes known as Sapir-Whorf, that
Worf, yes.
because of the way, well, you can also say more broadly linguistic relativity. I would say that there is still active work in that, but usually it tends to focus on relatively small and specific effects rather than sort of broad cognitive patterns. There's this great sci-fi book called Babel 17 where they theorize that a language really can constrain, like, in a very dramatic way, what you think is possible and how you act and how you live your life. But I think most active research in this regard is a bit smaller scale, I would say. What would you say, Daniel?
It's the claims have become more modest over time. Mm. I had a question, Madalena. You're coming at this from an evolutionary biologist's perspective, doing a book about language, and the book has kind of led you here with us linguists, and probably taken you into a lot of linguistic spaces. Is that strange for you? And how do you feel sort of coming into the linguistic space, and what's been your experience with linguists? What's the response been?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because I only, before you contacted me, I only had one email from a linguist who is in his 80s, lives in Australia, actually lives in Queensland. So we had this long conversation, which was very confusing to me because he started mentioning all these people who work in linguistics that, of course, I've never heard of because I'm not a linguist. And in the end, he wanted to let me know that he actually agrees with my thesis, yet then sent me a massively long document about cognition because I think what he's trying to do is trying to link cognition, the evolution of cognition and language. Anyway, but then I never had time to read it because then I was going to Argentina for 5 weeks and I only just got back. So I was actually a bit scared because it was not my intention to put the evolution of language in the title of the book because I never set out to answer that question. But
Interesting.
published
Okay.
have their
Who
own
convinced
mind.
you of the title?
The publisher, well, my editor, I think, and
Fair enough.
also because somewhere it says that I also criticize Steven Pinker, which I don't really.
Why not?
We're not huge fans of Pinker on this
Yeah.
podcast, I can tell you, but
Yeah, I gather that.
yeah.
Okay, so it's just us basically. So
I don't know enough about linguistics because it was, as I said, answering
Mm.
how we came to speak and why was never something I set out to address.
Well, it sounds like what you've done is taken like a very broad view and summarized a lot of research for a general audience, which is always really useful. I think as scientists, sometimes when we're in it, when we're the fish in water, we think these grand synthesis arguments are sort of obvious. So some of the things you've mentioned, I've heard other people say like, oh, and everyone knows that like this is kind of how this works because of that study and this study. But it's always great when someone takes the time to sort of synthesize it, especially for a general audience.
And
So it
especially
sounds
with an
really useful.
interesting angle like evolutionary biology. I will just say for the record that as a linguist, I read the entire thing and I never found anything that made me go, "Oh fuck, that was rank. That's out of
Embarrassing.
date." Or, "Oh my god." No, I never said that because I always thought, "Nope, this there's nothing here that strikes me as not very solid." Just so you know.
Well, thank you. Because the weird thing is that the book wasn't reviewed either. I know that the publisher had a few proofreaders, because I got something wrong with Trotsky. Apparently, I called Trotsky something he wasn't at the time because that office didn't exist at the time, and there was something else. So from that, I do know that some people read it, but I don't think anyone with a specific linguistic background or evolutionary biology background read it. So it was a bit scary, to be honest, to see the book go out in the world and think, well, especially since it's the origin of language in the title, and I'm not a linguist, but I survived. I'm still here.
It's a hardcore title, that's for sure.
Did you know that the Evoland conference abstract submission deadline got extended? You could probably still submit to it if you wanted.
Which conference
It's
is that?
the Evoland conference. It's the most fun. It's the evolution of language conference.
Yeah, but that's scary.
I don't think they'd have you for lunch.
That's no, that's a really cute, and that's like the Sean's crowd. That's
Exactly.
a nice.
Exactly. No, I think you had some good chats.
I think they're the nice ones.
They are. I got a question. You mentioned this is just, I'm just getting all the last questions that I want to get in here. You mentioned child cuteness as a motivating factor. Do you have an explanation for cute aggression or what's known as gigil? The way that you want to just grab a cute infant and aggress them, and I want to bite you and tear you apart. What's behind that?
I don't know. Weirdness?
It's really normal.
I had it yesterday with one of my cats. I was just like this with him. I never hurt him. That's the interesting thing. We all have the instinct. We all want to like bite or crush, but it never, of course, happens.
It is true because parents do, and grandparents, I guess, do tend to bite the bottoms after they cleaned of the babies, don't they?
How can you
Yes,
not?
this is the thing.
How can you not?
It's probably
But
just so. Konrad Lorenz had this theory about overstimulant. What do they
mm,
call it in German? I can't remember, but basically that many organisms have this well, they basically have this overreaction to a particular stimulus. The reaction to the stimulus has an evolutionary advantage, but you can take it too far. Yeah, and actually, I think there's Nico Timberger did this wonderful experiment with, I think, oyster catchers, birds that nest on the ground. So they gave
I think I
them
know this.
eggs of, the normal size eggs,
Increase
and
in
then
size.
made them bigger, and they just went for the biggest egg, which would never, ever, ever work. But it's the stimulus is there's an egg. I need to incubate the egg. So maybe for us, the stimulus is there's something really cute and I have to look after it. But I take it a little bit too far and bite it on its bottom.
I'm so glad you brought up the bird egg because I have been telling people that exact same fact and I thought it was geese, but I've been trying to look it up, but maybe it was.
Now the geese is with Lawrence, where because the geese imprint on the first living thing that they see when they come out of the egg, and they just happen to see him. So this is wonderful photo of him walking through the meadows with all the little geese behind him. But the other one, it may not be an oyster catcher, but it's definitely a bird that breeds on the ground. But
Hmm.
it's this famous drawing that Tim
I've
Timber
seen it
made
too. I've heard
himself.
about it because people say the
Mm,
same thing about like humans' reaction to sugar. That like in our environment, having some sugar was good, and we never had access to these amounts of sugar. So having the instinct to just eat sugar when we see it is was good for hundreds and thousands of years. And it's not until like the last 200 years that it's become a problem, and we don't have a cap
We broke the
because
food
we never
game.
needed one. And
Hmm.
these
okay.
birds don't have a cap on like how large an egg should be because they never encountered a silly human who gave them like an egg 3 times the size of a normal egg. That's not,
Exactly.
again, humans are, we're not, we're,
We're, we're,
we choose to do strange
we're these
things.
weird beasts.
Yeah.
The book is The Origin of Language, How We Learn to Speak and Why. It's available now from Simon & Schuster. We're talking to the author, Professor Madeleine Beekman. Madeleine, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us. This has been a really good chat.
Well, thank you. And thank you for not eating me, even though you couldn't because
Coming
online.
over. Coming
Or
over.
you
You
coming
get
over?
Sydney.
But it's no, it's what we asked earlier, what's it like to enter a new world? I find it fascinating talking to people who have different backgrounds and have been thinking about things in a very different way. So it's really delightful. And thank you for making the time and your interest.
Our pleasure.